again, it goes back to like these things don't have to be so isolated. Because you are ambitious
Mhm.
doesn't mean you have to abandon your identity. You can bring that forward. And I think that Ku is a great example of someone who's carrying their culture and their identity with them along the journey. And I think it's just like taking time to ground your feet and acknowledge where you're standing and to just take a minute to remember these things, whether that's through running or through ceremony or through whatever practice that you have, just creating space for yourself and know that
Mhm.
the future of opportunities is going to exist no matter what choices and what things come up in today's like modern age that you have to fulfill these obligations. But there's always, it's never too late to come back to culture and community.
Welcome, everyone. This is Jermaine Jackson, producer here at Daybreak Star Radio, the only station indigenizing the airwaves. And today, we are honored to sit down with two powerful voices behind one of the most compelling indigenous stories being told right now. Joining us is Koo Stevens, an elite runner whose journey is about more than just crossing the finish lines. It's about honoring legacy, healing intergenerational trauma, and standing firm on identity. Alongside him is Paige Bethmann, a filmmaker based in Reno, Nevada, whose work has been featured by ESPN, Vox Media, PBS, and YouTube Originals. Now she made her feature directorial debut with Remaining Native, a deeply personal documentary supported by Sundance, the International Documentary Association, and more. So this isn't just a sports story, it's a story of survival, strength, and staying rooted while reaching for the future. And Ku and Paige, welcome and thanks for joining us. How are you both feeling today?
Segos Kanagawago, Paige Bethman Yon Guts. Hi, my name is Paige Bethman. I'm a Haudenosaunee filmmaker. I'm originally from upstate New York. My family comes from both the Akwesasne Mohawk Reservation and the Oneida Nation.
Hamane, I Numa Dui, Nukitavan Stevens, Minania Tabusi Dakara. Hello, my relatives. I'm from the Arrington Paiute tribe, and my name is Kevin Stevens. Yeah, the Arrington Paiute tribe. That's what I'm repping.
Paige, let's begin with you. So you've worked in mainstream media for networks like ESPN, Vox, and PBS, but this is your first feature documentary. What called you to remaining native, and why did Ku's story resonate so deeply with you?
Working in film and TV for a while in New York, I felt like it gave me a really good experience in regards to producing and putting together creative work. But the subject matters that I was working on wasn't necessarily like something I felt that was like deeply personal. And I think in 2021, when the news was coming out about the Kamloops children that were discovered in unmarked graves, it started, you know, garnering all these reactions, not just from people who didn't know about the history of Indian boarding schools, but from my community members, people and ancestors who've been telling their stories for forever. And it brought back a lot of memories about my family. My great grandmother went to a Catholic boarding school in upstate New York, and it left, ripples in my family history. And I think I was looking for a way to honor her story and trying to figure out, what to do in this space. And that's when I saw an article that was written about Ku and his intentions to retrace his great grandfather's 50 miles. And I thought, wow, like like visual that is, just like the act of running and going through that, and putting yourself through that experience and really trying to literally like walk in someone else's shoes, but also seeing a young person who is having to deal with the impacts of this history in a modern context, and even being like a generation or two removed from that history, it still affects us. We can't just detach ourselves from the history. We have to learn how to handle it and carry it responsibly. And so I felt like the film was an opportunity to tell a story that can resonate with not just boarding school survivors, but for all ages and all people.
So, Ku, when you first learned about your great grandfather's escape from boarding school, what impact did that have on how you saw yourself, not just a runner, but as a young native man?
When I first heard about the story, I was still pretty young. I didn't exactly realize the weight of what had happened. We were just going to about another basketball tourney at Stewart, and it was just like a res ball tourney that they hosted annually. And he told me about that as we drove by, and I guess I kind of just brushed it off. Yeah, like I said, I didn't really realize. And then later on, I read a book called "There My Heart at Wounded Knee," and for me, that was like a big kind of a aha moment, I would say. Um, it changed a lot for me on how I view Native American history, and American history at that. And so when I kind of connected those two things to my grandfather and my people and realized that wasn't an isolated situation that happened to my grandfather alone, but to, an entire nation, an entire continent. Um, so it kind of set my life on a path that was for my people, for trying to represent them in the best way that I know how. And most of the time that's through running. So yeah, history can be sad and it could loom over you, but it can also be empowering. And so I feel like me and Paige have done a really good job at bringing that to light as well.
So, Paige, you mentioned in your writing that your great grandmother was a boarding school survivor as well. You kind of touched on it, but how did your personal family history influence how you approached this story of Kuz, and how did that shape your connection with Ku and his family?
Yeah, I think like Ku mentioned, these aren't isolated experiences, but they're also not monolithic. And I think for me, it was important to show up in the community. I'm not from there. And I think the lessons that I learned from my grandma, who was a, big activist, she was sort of taking charge of reconnecting and really trying to combat the results of forced assimilation. She started a after school program for Native children in Rochester to come and learn their history and their language and their culture. And so I was a part of that program. Both my parents were a part of that program and my brother. And so I think for me, it was trying to learn that, being just being young in a world that is setting you up to not embrace your culture. There's so many things out there that are obstacles in the way of doing traditional things or even just having opportunities to come together in community. I think that was for me wanting to approach the film like she taught me, was to show up and to understand the place and the land and the stories of that place and the people of that place. And so I moved from New York to Reno, where I've been for the last 3.5 years, to make sure that I was in community with Ku and his family and showing up without the camera. As much filming as we did, there was a lot of time where we just ate meals and hung out and went fishing and did a lot of things that really set us up to be able to represent the story in the most accurate way as we can.
So, Ku, so let's go back to retracing your great grandfather's 50-mile escape route. Well, and that was such a powerful act of remembrance. So, what was the journey like for you physically and then like spiritually as well?
It brings up old trauma. And in the film, we mention how all those emotions kind of come back. And so, with the discovery of the 215 kids in Kamloops, Canada, all those elders that had suffered those things in the past, that was all brought back to the surface. So, I feel like for me, spiritually, it was, like I said, it was deep, it was heavy. I've had, a lot of older people come up to me and thank me for telling their story in such a way. Same can be said for Paige, in such a way that it was good for them to cope and to heal and to see that they weren't alone in that. And, you know, we all want to be understood. We all want to be understood in a way that is healthy and that is, not in a way of pity or just to feel bad for, but sorry for lack of better words. Those elders spiritually, I feel like they can heal from the film. But physically, the run, it was hard. It's mid-August, early August. It's hot. There's not much cover. It's sandy, there's water, there's tons of elevation gain. And then you got to camp overnight, and then you wake up and you do it all over again for another 25 miles. So it's not easy. And, I like to say, like, the last time that I did it, the fourth Remembrance run was just me alone. And I decided to do all 50 miles all in one go. And I could confidently say it was probably the hardest thing I've ever done. And, thinking back to all those kids that had to do that journey, whether it was 50 miles, 100 miles, even farther than that. There's stories of these kids running from Oklahoma back to the West or East Coast. To think that they had to go through that. My 50-mile sacrifice with Gatorade and snacks and a good support team of my mom and my dad, it seems like nothing.
Paige, let's talk about your grandmother. And I think you said your grandmother told stories from her heart as a Mohawk storyteller. Is that correct? And then, so how has her influence shaped your own voice behind the camera? And what responsibility do you feel as a native filmmaker right now?
Last weekend I got married, and one of our community members, she told we our wedding was about the strawberry ceremony, and the way that she told the story, she said, "I'm going to channel like Paige's grandmother because my grandmother was so animated, so detailed. She was always like going into different voices and just like really creating a world visually with just her words." And I think I was always moved and inspired and locked in as a little kid, like listening to her. And I think I really wanted to do that in the film with texture visually, really focusing on things that were more subtle, listening to the stories of Koo's family who told me, oh, they would go pine nut picking in this area, or, this is where they thought like they would go and hang out at the reservoir or whatever. And I wanted to make sure that those things were in the film. And, people who are from that area would appreciate, seeing pine nuts or seeing buckberries and seeing things that are from, his community. And I'm, a visitor there. So I wanted to do my due diligence and understand that responsibility that my grandmother always told me was to, always pay tribute to the land that you're on. And I think, for me, my way of filmmaking is really talking to her. I feel like that is what I feel when I'm making work is that I'm able to still connect with her and talk to her, and I see little moments in the film that she shines like through, and so that makes me feel really good.
Actually, let's go back to Koo. Throughout the film, you're balancing your dream of becoming an elite runner with your cultural values and community ties. So now, what does success look like for you now? And has that definition changed since you began, or since the filming began?
I don't want to go off and do all these things for my people and in the name of my people, and in the process lose, my cultural identity. To do all these things, to go out into the big world and advocate for Native Americans in any sense or manner, but then come home and kind of forget what it was that I was advocating for.
Mm.
And I feel like for a lot of Native Americans, that can happen. That could be kind of intimidating, like a reason to not leave, the res or a colony or just that that cultural family that surrounds you. But to any people, to any Native Americans out there listening, it's necessary. My dad talks about in the film the brain drain syndrome, where your people go out and get educated, but they don't come home, and all that precious knowledge is lost. And for me, hearing that, I didn't know he said that before. And when I watched the film for the first time at South by Southwest, um, you can't help but feel a little bad because that's my plan is to go out and get educated and then come home at a later time. I'm not gonna be back on the res as a young man because I do think I could go out into the world and advocate for Native Americans on a political level, on a spiritual level. We've talked about doing a res tour, and I think I could do a lot of healing and help through that. And so for me personally, I got to handle some of my bigger aspirations first, and then I could come home and really help my community on a more just in-depth level.
Okay, Paige, let's stick with you. So, Remaining Native has already won multiple awards, including at South by Southwest and the Dallas International Film Festival. What has it meant to see the story being honored in such big stages, and what do you hope non-native audiences take away from it?
Sometimes the festival experience can feel pretty exclusive, though. I think that the audiences that we hope to connect with aren't always there. It's sometimes like really unfortunate to see that, like, certain communities like can't come because of the pricing or just like the structures of a film festival, and it can kind of keep people out. And so I think what we've been able to do with like trying to do community screenings and have events outside of the film screening itself has been really rewarding and powerful. And that has meant the most to me is when people who can see themselves in the film and can resonate and learn, are able to share that and are able to come and participate. I think for non-native audiences, I think the film is a coming of age sports story. It's not so, you don't need to be interested or know the history of boarding schools to like resonate with the film. And I think what I hope is it ignites enough curiosity from people who may not know this, to Google it, to educate themselves, to learn and find out about the people in which they occupy, like their lands, and to really interrogate their own family histories and connection, and what are they doing to honor their families, and connect culturally. And I think, just seeing a inspiring young person achieve something, not only on the level that he's at as an athlete, but as just a good person. I really hope it opens up opportunities for people to support youth and to support, people who are also interested in becoming leaders and doing good work in their communities as well.
Ku, what would you say to other Native youth watching your story, especially those who are trying to find their balance between ambition and cultural identity?
As a young man, my focus was primarily on sports. I knew that once I got into high school that I had a very potentially great career in running. And with that, I wasn't able to attend like language gatherings or bear camp or these things, these other ceremonies that I had done religiously since I was a kid. My dad would always make sure I was there, and you know, it it, it definitely is. It's hard. It's hard to make those decisions, and I would say to any youth out there listening is to really just like, it's just to follow your heart. Is to it's it'll all work out in the end. All things happen for a reason. And if you're supposed to be somewhere, I'm under the impression that you're going to be there. And with that, you have to accept that that's what was supposed to happen, even if you miss out on, a potentially very like impactful and heavy ceremony that you could have gone to. Um, it's okay. It's okay to miss things. It's okay to not always feel like you're making the right decision, because in the end, I think that you know, it's not, it'll work out. It'll work out.
Again, it goes back to like these things don't have to be so isolated. Because you are ambitious doesn't mean you have to abandon your identity. You can bring that forward. And I think that Ku is a great example of someone who's carrying their culture and their identity with them along the journey. And I think it's just like taking time to ground your feet and acknowledge where you're standing and to just take a minute to remember these things, whether that's through running or through ceremony or through whatever practice that you have, just creating space for yourself and know that the future of opportunities is going to exist no matter what choices and what things come up in today's like modern age that you have to fulfill these obligations. But there's always, it's never too late to come back to culture and community.
In order to find your creative self, you need to dive into what you like. And I say this because, if you go to film school, if you attain higher education, even if you're just on social media, people are always telling you what to watch. Like, this is the pinnacle. You need to be going to watch Christopher Nolan.